Thank you all so much. Thank you, Deborah and Russ, for inviting me. And thank you to all of you who are here tonight. I'm overwhelmed by so many people having an interest in my work and in this topic. And so I'm looking forward to a wonderful evening of talking about this. So I'm going to share my screen because I think, yes, here we go. Okay, great. So as Deborah mentioned, I am going to be talking tonight about the characters Tabitha and Lydia in Acts of the Apostles. And this research really came out of not any big dramatic story, but more that I was pressed to find something to write about. And my dissertation director said, why don't you take a look at Acts? And when I read through Acts, I found these two women rose to the surface for me. And when I started looking into this more and more, I realized that really no one was talking about them at the time. And when they did, they would give them titles like cosmopolitan hostess. And I thought that there was something more to be done. So I started looking into this, and it's become something of an obsession for me, looking into both these characters and also many of the other women in early Christianity. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is method. And method is not sexy, but I think it's really important that you understand where I'm coming from and how I came to some of these readings of these texts. So I don't think that we are floating minds. I think that we are embodied human beings. And when we read things, we read them with our whole body. We don't just understand them, but we understand them. So I use two kind of markers. So historical imagination, that's how do we understand? How do we imagine the lives of women in Greco-Roman society? Who do we imagine Tabitha and Lydia to have been? And then the feeling part of it. When we read something, how do we feel? What sensations do we have? Do we get sort of a sinking feeling in our stomach? Are we excited? I think that's something to be really to pay attention to when we're reading. So what feelings come up? How do we feel about the roles and the influence and the way that something is being presented? So I come at this with a deep respect for history, but also a deep respect for the way in which these texts reach across history and touch us right now. So both of those things are, I hope, true tonight, is that you will learn something, but you will also feel something when we're done. So these are two texts that are not in Acts, but this is an example of what I mean. When we read these two texts that are part of the New Testament, one comes from 1 Corinthians and one comes from 1 Timothy, they are actually related. They are very similar. So if you read this, you might, as I usually do, have a reaction to them. I might imagine that these were written in a world where perhaps there was a tremendous amount of misogyny, or that women weren't allowed to do so many things and they were held back. I also might feel something about the way that these texts might still continue to be enacted in our own world. And so they reach across time and they affect me. So when my students read these passages, they're always like, ugh. You know, they have a visceral reaction to it. And they also imagine that they come out of a world that was very different from ours. So I instead have a little bit here. What I want to talk about is, instead of, well, let me back up. I'm getting over COVID, so sometimes I have moments where I might like have to backtrack a little bit. Um, we can either look at passages like that, the previous passages. We might look at them and say, oh, we have to read these normatively, as many conservative churches do. And they say, well, these are written, they're sacred scripture. We have to take these and we have to assume that they are true. Or we might say, well, these are such terrible texts and I don't even want to deal with them. So I, like someone like Starhawk would say, let's get rid of them and not even read them. And I'm a fan, actually, of the reading the gaps like Linda Maloney, who is one great Acts scholar, who I stand on the shoulders of. And Linda says that reading the gaps allows us to perhaps take something away, even from passages that might give us that visceral reaction. What can we learn, and how can they help us understand early Christianity more complexly? So here's an example of reading the gaps. Now, I put in red this passage that I think it is pretty difficult. It's written by Tertullian in the 2nd century CE. He's writing about this text called the Acts of Paul and Thecla that was enormously popular with early Christians, especially early Christian women. They loved it. Thecla's out on an adventure. She ditches her fiance. She leaves her home. She follows Paul. She baptizes herself. She speaks to authority. She and Paul have ritual together. It's this really interesting early Christian text. And Tertullian, instead of reading it and saying, well, that's interesting that women are baptizing themselves and others and leading this missionary activity, he says, well, actually, this is a false document, right? He said, how consonant would it seem with faith that he, Paul, should give women power to teach and baptize when he is the one who says that they shouldn't? So let them keep silence, he says, and go to their husbands for advice at home. And then in the 20th century, Wilhelm Schneemalker says he agrees with Tertullian. He says, basically, on a sober treatment of the evidence, hypotheses such as these feminist readings of Paul and Thecla appear to be no more than the products of modern fancy without any basis in the sources. So, actually, what I wanted to say here is that what I want to challenge here is that we have to read the gaps. Do we assume that Tertullian is right and that women were not allowed to teach or to baptize? Or do we presume instead that he's reacting to a movement in early Christianity where women were doing exactly that? And he's a conservative pushback against that kind of missionary activity and leadership amongst women. The reason I use Schneemalker here is to say that he is suggesting that we need to look at particular sources. But if we only look at Paul's texts, like Tertullian is using, we're missing the full picture of what's going on in Christianity, early Christianity. So if we narrow the lens so greatly that we're only looking at a few passages, then we get a very narrow view. If we broaden the lens to things like grave inscriptions, letters, other types of papyri, we find that the view is actually more complex about what women were allowed to do in the Greco-Roman world and not. So even in this instance where he says, Paul himself says this, in fact, if we look at that passage that he's quoting, which is 1 Corinthians 14, it was said, if we look at this passage, we can see, I've highlighted that really the theme of this passage, it begins with brothers and sisters. So it's addressing a mixed group of both genders, that everyone should speak and have an opportunity to speak, and everyone should have an opportunity to prophesy, but just that it should be done in good order so that not everybody's talking over one another. And that everybody gets their turn. And then he ends, therefore, brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, but just in fitting order. Now, if you have a good eye, you've noticed that I've cut something out of this passage, but I did it for a very important reason, because we can see how many times speaking and prophecy are used, and that's the theme. But if we go to the full passage, what I haven't read here is what I've excised from that previous passage. It actually is dissonant with what goes before and after. And there is, if we look carefully, as Schneemelker said, at the sources, scholars say that actually this seems like an insertion because it's not in all of the manuscripts. So really, this is at variance with what Paul says about women and their ability to prophesy and be in church and to speak in church. But also in Romans, it says, and this is just one passage that I'm pulling out, we have Phoebe, who is a deacon of the church. And she is a benefactor of many people. We have Prisca, which is just a diminutive of Priscilla, and her husband, and she's listed first. And it's the same actually in Acts 18. She's listed twice, first before her husband. So she's kind of the important one in the pair. And we also have Mary, and we have Junia, who is an apostle. So Paul seems very comfortable working alongside of women, having women in leadership roles, speaking, teaching, all of these things. So actually, Schneemelker is looking at a very narrow bunch of texts in order to say that women were very circumscribed in their abilities in early Christianity. I disagree. So we need to break assumptions here. Even if we go outside of the Bible, Plautus, who was a playwright in this first century world, talks about, I cannot stomach these women from these great families shouting their bossy ways, their cloaks, their dyed cloth. They reduce their husbands to slavery with their extravagance. Now, am I going to accept Plautus and say that was the state of the world? Or again, read the gap and say, actually, Plautus is probably one member of an elite group of men who didn't like it when women went outside the home and went outside of sort of that circumscribed area that he thought that they belonged in. So Roman society, at least at the upper levels and the patrician levels, tended to be very conservative. But women at that level had a lot of freedom. And not just at the patrician level, but also at the level of freed women as well. So just as I'll get into this a little bit more as we go along, but we might notice that Lydia commands Paul and all of his male followers. She says, baptize me and come to my house and you're going to stay here. And he says, okay. She also commands her own household. She says, we're all going to be baptized. So she's clearly a leader, not only of her household, but of that particular community that she comes from. Both Lydia and Tabitha are both engaged in the cloth trade. They have their own businesses. They have their own authority, autonomy, and money. Neither of them is attached to a husband. So why do we assume marital status, as so many commentators do? They say, well, they're probably widows, or she's divorced. And my pushback to that is, why? Why do we assume something about these women that the text leaves blank? So as I get into both of these women, I want you to maybe think about your own assumptions about women in the Greco-Roman world. Maybe you come in thinking that that world is very different than our own, and you would be right in many, many, many ways. But also it's very similar in that there's a complexity there. There are lots of different ways that men and women operate in the world. We think that there are some norms, but those norms are always broken. We can find ways in which they were broken, and that seems to also be a norm as well. So women worked. They did not all stay home, and they weren't all confined to their homes. Sandra Joshel and Susan Trajari have analyzed the occupational inscriptions. These are just from Rome. So there's also data from other areas, but I'll just look at from Rome since that's a big sample size. Almost 80% of the women that come in, that we find in these occupational inscriptions, were involved in the cloth trade, whether that was dyeing, spinning, a whole host of ways in order to bring cloth from its inception to the marketplace. So we have silk workers, purple dyers. We have also people who are tailors of clothing, but very specialized, some that only work with gold leaf on the clothing. So we have office managers as well that oversee, women who oversee workshops where the cloth trade is happening. We also have a list of women that are involved in traditionally what scholars said were masculine trades, such as jewelry makers or ironsmiths or makers of gold leaf. These, we find women's names there as well. So again, norms, yes, maybe they were traditionally male occupations and categories, but those norms were broken by women all the time. So we also find women who were called dealers. And when they're called dealers of cloth, they are not like just sitting in a little booth in the marketplace. They are sort of larger scale dealers of cloth or whatever it is. Pulse is like a grain. So they have larger authority. They might even, as we'll find with Navolia Tike, who is from Pompeii, she has a shipping company that ships grain between Egypt and the Italian peninsula. So we have a lot of assumptions about what women did and did not do, but the papyri and the inscriptions confound those norms. And even from the perspective of when we have shops where women and men are working together, many scholars, not Joshel and Trajari, but male scholars who did this work before them, assumed that the women and the men were married. But again, there's nothing to tie the women and the men together. They could simply be co-workers, but many times women are named as the officinatrix, so the overseer or the office manager, or the negotiatrix, who is sort of the bigger boss, if you will. So again, breaking these assumptions. So I'm just going to show you a few slides of different kinds of women in different kinds of occupations. So the first one that I have here is Septimia Stratonice, and Septimia is a shoemaker, which is a traditionally masculine trade in Rome. This is from Ostia Antica, if anyone's ever been there. And this is a plaque that this is her funerary inscription that was given to her by her son. Here we have Septimia, who is not shown with her husband. He's not mentioned in the inscription. Her son is mentioned because he says, I dedicate this to my mother. But she's shown by herself holding out a little foot that is the mold for the shoe. And so it shows her in this chair where she's the one who's in charge of the shop. Not only is she the worker, but she's the owner. So these are the kinds of occupations, not high level, but also not the lowest level either. She's a business owner. We also find someone like Umakia, who is much more on this larger scale level. So she's the daughter of Lucius, she's a public priestess, and she says in her own name. So she is claiming the title not from her father or her husband, but through her own power and authority. She also says that she put up this inscription with her own money. So her husband is on the other side of this inscription, but he's not in this part, which means that she's claiming for herself a status apart from him and apart from her role as a wife and mother. So this Umakia inscription is found in a building that is dedicated to her by a group of tradespeople. So there's a statue in the middle of this building, and it says that the fullers, a group that works with cloth, have dedicated this entire building to Umakia, who was their patroness, their benefactor. So she's not just someone who's a business owner, she is, but also she's someone who is sort of a high-level public figure, who when tradespeople come to Pompeii, that she has a space for them where they could stay, she could make introductions, they could do business, all of this happening in sort of a protected environment. So she is a patroness and benefactor of the trades in this town. She is someone like Junia Theodora, who's another example of this. So there are 5 inscriptions to her in Roman Corinth, and they date to the late 1st century. So right around the time that is like our sweet spot for talking about the New Testament. It says, from the Lycian League to Junia Theodora, a Roman, a woman good and capable and well disposed to the people. This is just one particular part of it. So in these 5 inscriptions, she's honored not just for being a nice woman, but also for her commercial and political patronage. So like Umakia, she has a bigger scope of authority over people in her city. So she's native to Lycia, but she is in Roman Corinth, and she has this scope of authority. She welcomes ambassadors and exiles and citizens of Lycia into her home, advocates on their behalf, and protects them. So this reflects other inscriptions that we find of similar benefactors or benefactresses who acted as merchant dealers and negotiators, and hospitality. But hospitality in this particular case is not just welcoming somebody into your home, but making introductions, advocating for their political needs, working with them while they are in the city so that they can accomplish their goals before they leave. So she is someone who is a high-level political figure. We find these in Corinth and Thessalonica and Philippi. Philippi I saved for last because that'll be important when we come to Lydia. So one final, and then we'll actually move on to Tabitha and Lydia, I promise. So Navalia Tike is the one that I was talking about earlier. This woman has a shipping industry that she is responsible for. So her funerary inscription is paid for herself and her husband. So she's the one in this relationship that has all the juice, so they say. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Augustus, but she built in her lifetime this monument also for the freedmen and freedwomen of her household. So I bring this up and I highlight this because this is very much like the character of Lydia, is that she has this business, she's a dealer, she has this larger sort of authority in her city, but also she has the authority over a household group as well. Okay. So these are just one more tomb of a husband and wife duo that had a baking business. But the one on the slide on the left shows you that this is no small tomb. This is a very large, costly, expensive tomb. They are dressed in very expensive clothing. So they're not local bakers. It looks like they have a quite large business, and they're shown to be partners in this business on the tomb. So again, just breaking these assumptions that men and women, couples work together, but also women worked independently in their own businesses. They sometimes were the ones who had all of the power in the relationship because they either came from wealthy families, a wealthy family, or they were more successful than their husbands. Okay, so these are, again, just a few more women and men working in the butcher shop together. They are, it says husband and wife in the inscription, but she's the one who has the very elaborate hairstyle. That's the word I'm looking for. So she is the one who is sort of the one with the money. She's also keeping the books. So she might be the office manager of this particular business. We also have a woman working in a butcher shop that does not have a husband with her. These men over on the side are patrons of that business. We also have a woman selling vegetables in her own shop. So this is the plaque that would be above the door of her shop. So we have women from the very highest levels to women who are owning small businesses in the Greco-Roman world. So finally, we come to Tabitha and Lydia in Acts. And I do this very long setup because I want you to see that these two women are not anomalies. They fit perfectly within this Greco-Roman societal matrix that I have talked about. And they also fit into a larger picture of early Christianity and the types of dynamic movements that were going on there that we also see reflected in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So if you happen to want to follow along, I do have the passages up here. If you have your Bible with you, that would be terrific. Otherwise, I recommend BibleGateway.com, and you can choose the NRSV version of these stories. So if we look at Acts 9 first, Acts 9:36 to 43, the story of Tabitha Dorcas. So she has two names. One name is her Semitic name and the other is her Greek name. And that was also pretty common, especially in that particular region where people would have two different names, one that they would use in their own community, and then a name that they would use like their business name for people who maybe couldn't pronounce Tabitha. Sorry, there we go. I don't know why that is gone. Isn't that strange? Okay, something happened to my text, but now I'm back in business. So if you have your Bible with you, you might have this particular story labeled something like Peter in Lydda and Joppa. Maybe does anyone I would be really surprised. I wish that I could interact with you better, but does anyone have a biblical passage that mentions Tabitha or Lydia, and Tabitha or Dorcas? Meaning in the title. Does it say anything about her? No?
Folks,
Yeah.
I will enable the, oh, I'm sorry. I just want to say I'll enable the chat so that if anyone does have something, they can put it in the chat.
Wonderful. Most of the time, I will say that that is not the case. Most of the time, it highlights Peter. And this is part of the problem for me when I was looking at this particular text is why is Tabitha erased from this story? Why are we only focusing on Peter? I understand that he resuscitates her, but she has a vital role in this account. And it's also pretty shocking when we look at it in some detail. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. Now, Tabitha is the only woman in the entire New Testament who has the title disciple. That seems to me pretty important. And when I looked farther afield, there's only a very few places where women are called disciples, even in this larger space of the Greco-Roman world. So to give her this title of disciple seems very significant. And yet, this isn't really mentioned most of the time in the scholarship about her. Or they'll say something like, she's a disciple, but that just means that she was a member of the community. False. They don't give titles in the New Testament unless they're important. So we also could see that she's told she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. So she's a benefactress, not only to her Christian community, but also to the community at large. And these, when people are given these kinds of markers, what it says is that this, not only does it shed good light on her, but it sheds good light on the entire community who lives with her, that she is someone who is devoted to not only her business, but what she does with her money is she takes care of people who are in need. So she doesn't keep all the profits to herself. She actually is someone who gives back to her community. So another thing that we might notice is that she works with a large group of widows in a small home business, or maybe a large home business. We don't know. It doesn't tell us how many widows, but they're all present and they're all devastated that Tabitha has died, because not only is she someone that they worked with, but she is their benefactress. And so when Peter shows up, they show him the clothing that they all made when they were together, and they are sad because the hole that her death has created in the community is so significant because she was so important to them. We might also notice that Peter comes immediately when called. So the disciples at Joppa send two emissaries and they say, Peter, you have to come. Tabitha has died. And he doesn't say, well, I'm actually in the middle of something, or I'll come tomorrow morning. It's not convenient. He picks up, he gets up, he comes immediately, and he resuscitates her and restores her to the community because she is such a vital member of it and important. We also, final notice is that she has a room a house that has an upper room. This means that her house was rather large by Greco-Roman standards. I say CF Mark 1:30-31 because in the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus walks in the front door and we know that he's in a one-room house because he can see Peter's mother-in-law laying down right in front of him. Here, Tabitha is in an upper room, so her house is significantly larger. So this home business seems to be profitable enough for her to be a benefactress to her community. Okay. So what do we know about Lydia? So let's turn to Acts 16, verse 16. So this is a pretty short, I'm sorry, 16, that's the wrong one, 11 to 15. Okay. So again, you might have in your particular Bible, you might have something about the conversion of Lydia. But Lydia is actually not converting. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I'm just going to mention it. But that very idea of conversion puts the emphasis on Paul, who is supposedly the one doing the converting, as opposed to Lydia being the active agent in this story. She is much more active than Paul. She is much more authoritative than Paul in this story. So we meet her on the Jewish Sabbath in a synagogue. It's called, they say, a place of prayer, but it's a synagogue. So she's with a whole group of women in a synagogue praying on the Sabbath. And then we find out that she is a worshiper of God, meaning the God of Israel. So she's already a convert to Judaism. We know that God worshipers were converts to Judaism to some degree, but she's keeping the Sabbath, so she is an observant God worshiper. We also learn that she's a dealer, a negotiatrix of purple cloth, originally from the town of Thyatira. So just like Junia Theodora, she is a woman who comes from another place, but she has brought her business to the city of Philippi, and she exerts an authority in the city where Paul and his followers seek her out, or seek out this group of women that she works with in order to talk with them. She in the text asks for baptism for herself, but also on behalf of her household. And this is very unusual because usually we will see, at least in these more patrician texts, that women have to get permission from their husband in order to make these kinds of big life changes. But here in Acts, Lydia just says, I either don't have a husband, or I don't need to ask him, or whatever the case may be, but the text is silent. There's no male authority figure here in this particular passage, or a guardian, and she commands Paul to baptize her, and she commands that he baptize her household as well. If you maybe can't notice it as much in the English, but in the Greek, it's a series of commands. So Paul doesn't resist. Plautus said that he didn't like these bossy women, but apparently Acts is okay with Lydia being bossy. In fact, there are lots of bossy women in the New Testament who Jesus, and here Paul, says, good job. Being bossy is excellent, because you're putting yourself forward and you're putting your community forward, and you are advocating on behalf of God. So she is not a deferential woman, but yet she is shown to be a moral exemplar in Acts, and an exemplar of what women in the early Christian movement were supposed to be like. And in 1640, Paul and his entourage returned to Lydia's home to meet the church. So in a very short amount of time, she has become not only a community leader, but a house church leader. So much so that Paul wants to return to the city before he leaves the city and say goodbye and touch base with her. So women played a vital role in early Christianity. And as I say, yes, Paul founded all of these churches, true, but without people like Tabitha and Lydia and others, many, many other women like them, Paul would never have been able to get off the ground, because they were the dynamic force behind this, or at least it appears to be from these texts. So just in getting to know these two characters, we get to know a little bit about what Acts and early Christianity may have been like. So it wasn't just powerful men, it was also powerful women. It was women who were working on, not just working on behalf of men, but working on behalf of themselves and their own communities. They were the ones who were doing the traveling. They were the ones who were doing the advocating with local authorities. They were the ones who were benefactresses or patronesses to their communities, so important and vital to the life of the community that without them, the community was in peril of collapsing. So what do I want to conclude from this very short, brief introduction is that women were not ashamed of their job titles or their businesses. They displayed them proudly. They were happy to use their money on behalf of what they thought was important for themselves and their communities. They wanted to be commemorated for their livelihood and the relationships that they built through them. They are depicted as active workers, both in their trade and also in the gospel. And in breaking assumptions, we need to assume that when women and men are mentioned together, that they probably, well, they might be married, but they might also not be married. And Tabitha and Lydia fall very well into this context of women who acted independently as benefactresses and are of unspecified marital status. Oh, Thank you so much. I hope that that was an introduction to my work and to the women in Acts. And one other just final thing that I might say about this is that we know that Tabitha and Lydia are exemplars because we also have a woman, Sapphira, who in chapter 5 works alongside of her husband, but they use their money, their ill-gotten gains, for their own purposes, and they don't use them on behalf of their community, and they're criticized for that. So we have two women who are using their money, their power, their benefactions on behalf of the good of the whole community. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Teresa. That was wonderful. It always does my heart good to hear these authentic stories, because I mean, you know, I've been a Catholic for a very long time, and I've only gotten this through a very patriarchal lens. So it's, even though, you know, we study it and we're always doing it, it just to hear another time, it's just another way, and we can contradict those long held ways that these people have been presented to us. So everyone, we're going to open this up for questions. So if you have a question, you can use your little reaction button, hold your hand up. If you can't find that, do this, let me know, and we'll look for your hands. So please feel free to join in the conversation with a question or a comment. Just keep them kind of short and to the point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've got Joanna. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic talk. Thank you, Teresa. I've got a couple of quick questions. First question, would the only way women have had any independence and power be the fact that they would need to be financially independent, in other words, have their own business? And secondly, the two initial quotes you had from Corinthians, I think, and Timothy, the anti-women sort of quotes, is it possible, I have heard that they may have been written by people from the Pauline school and not by Paul himself, and that there may have been people with different opinions within that Pauline school, and that's not sharing what Paul actually believed. What are your thoughts on both those points?
So those are great questions. I'm going to actually answer the second one first. You are absolutely right, is that 1 Timothy almost certainly was not written by Paul. And because of the deep similarity between 1 Timothy 2, that excerpt that I showed you, and 1 Corinthians 14, it is more likely that someone from that later school wrote that passage and put it into the manuscript of Corinthians, rather than it being originally Pauline, because it's not in every version of the manuscript. So I would say almost 100% sure, as sure as we could be about these things, Paul did not write, definitely not 1 Timothy. So you're exactly, it's a contrast to everything else that Paul says in his letters about women and how he shares power with them throughout those letters. As far as the first question about the financial independence of women, so no, they could also be financially independent if they inherited from their families. So women inherited not only from parents, but they also inherited from grandparents. So it wasn't just the oldest male who got the whole inheritance. Women also were provided for. And if they didn't marry, their dowry money could certainly have supported them independently. But for the most part, if you didn't have a large dowry, if you were a woman who was of, maybe you didn't have a ton of money, your family didn't have a ton of money, you could use that little bit of money and go into business, or you could find a partner and go into business with them. And that's why we find these collaborative workshops a lot in at least the Roman inscriptions, and in some places in Roman Palestine. You'll find lots of women and men working together in these workshops to share the financial burden. Of course.
So much. That's great. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. We have another question here from Donna. Go ahead, Donna.
Teresa, from your last comment, it seems that there was some degree of acceptance of women in society. So my original question was the exclusion of these women in scripture, from your research and experience, could you attribute that to a small group of powerful men rather than society as a whole?
Yes, I think that one of the things I'm saying, yes, I think it is a small group of conservatives. And we see this struggle between sort of the conservative push and this more independent push in early Christianity. In a text like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, over against something like First Timothy and some of these other texts that are advocating on behalf of women being wives and mothers first. So Timothy says you'll be saved through childbearing. This is trying to inculcate in women that that's your primary duty, not being a leader, as opposed to in texts like the Acts of Paul and Thecla and these other texts that I've showed you tonight, where women are in leadership roles. And so whenever women are free, I think, this is my opinion, you will have a conservative backlash against that. And you have people who are in power, like the pastor who wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, who are pushing back against women's freedom, saying you're doing too much, you're too free, you're too bossy. And I think that, absolutely that's what's going on in early Christianity. And what wins ultimately are these more conservative voices. So women, though, of course, are resilient and they find other ways.
And Teresa, do you have any sense of whether or not the small conservative group were really intelligent, educated persons, or more of a group that may have been stirred up by other people, but had this prejudice against women?
Well, I think from what it's a hard question to answer, but from the writings of these more conservative authors, they are educated. They are very well versed, but they also have the most to lose because they are holding power in Greco-Roman society. Remember, it's a very hierarchical society. And so men want to hold on to the power that they have. And when women challenge that power, they can allow it to a certain extent, but when it gets to be a certain break point, if you will, then there's a real push against that. And they start making these claims like Tacitus, who says things like, oh, for the good old days when, we could lock up our wives and, they weren't allowed to speak until we asked them what their thoughts were. So is that what was happening? No, of course not. He's like waxing poetic, like, let's make Rome great again, kind of idea. But it's that I think that they were educated, but they were the people who had the most to lose, and they don't like to share power.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Sorry about that.
We have Rose.
I see. Oh yeah, I see Rose here. Okay, good. Rose, ask your question.
Okay. Hello. It was an amazing talk. Thank you.
Oh.
I'm just curious, what would it take for the women to not be erased in the Bible? What would it take for the women to come back to, I don't know, for this to be more widely known, for it to be in the lectionary? What would it take, really?
Oh, Rose, that is such a wonderful question. I feel ill-equipped to answer it because I make a lot of presentations on this material and I think people are interested in it. But I also think that we still, by and large, and I'm going to speak as a Catholic because that's the tradition that I know, but by and large, still in Catholic churches, you have the father says paradigm, right? People don't like to give up authority. And if you allow women to preach and teach, which they do, but, you know, within certain confines, I think we're still running up against men don't want to share the power. They fear this idea that women could become priests or even deacons or even, you know, leaders in church. And there's a real pushback against it. So there's a real conservative, I don't know if you've noticed this, but this is what I've noticed, a real conservative backlash in Catholicism against women's roles. And I think that, you know, more and more to just continually challenge that and to say, that's not the whole story. Because that's only one part of the story. That yes, there was a lot of misogyny in the Greco-Roman world. Yes, there was a lot of misogyny in early Christianity, but that's not the big news. The big news is that it was more complex than that there were a lot of women who shared power.
Thank you.
So I would just keep saying, if you find that yourself coming up against it, share my work and the work of so many other fabulous scholars who've done this work as well. Share that, share your own ideas about that. That's not the whole story.
I guess it seems like we need to move it from scholarly tradition and scholarly presentations to a more lived experience, like for it to be more, anyway, I don't know what I'm talking
Agreed.
about. Yeah.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Oh, you're
Thanks,
welcome.
Rose.
Thank you.
We all share that that hunger and thirst, and I think this continued work is just proof that we are moving that needle, but it's so slow sometimes. Mary Ellen, you have a question.
During the trip to Greece, we heard about the section about, wives be subject to their husbands, etc., that the original Greek does not have that, and that it was attached somehow in an addendum to something 300, 500 years later. And what they explained was that the Greek language, like other languages, has changed over time. And the earlier Greek scripts don't have that language in it. I think this was from some of the Greek people at one of the places we visited during the Greek trip. And I just wondered if you could comment on that, and if we have other instances of that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's such a great insight. And depending on which manuscripts we have and how those manuscripts are interpreted, the first act of interpretation is translation. So when we go from Greek to English or whichever language it is that we're translating into, we are making choices about how to render that in another language. We are also choosing which version of a text to use. So if we use a version of the text that has wives be subject to your husbands, then we are making a choice about how we want that passage to be interpreted and used. But those household codes are part of that conservative backlash in early Christianity. They are like, we need to get back to the basics. We need to get back to when men were men and women were women, that kind of narrative. Everybody in their place, because then society works very well. Well, that's not true, but it works well for them, right? So I think that you're exactly right. It depends on which manuscript and how we're translating it, which sources we're using and which sources we're choosing to ignore. Always.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Rita, you have a question?
Oh, hi, thank you, Teresa.
Oh, hi.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely, wonderful, and thank you, Deb and Russ, for bringing Teresa to us. So I was really struck with the images you had at the beginning of the women at work, basically.
Yeah.
And I love the one from Ostia. It reminded me, I don't know if you've seen the Julia Felix estate in Pompeii.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So she put a plaque out outside describing everything that you can get at her hotel. And it was really quite smart. Well, that was good advertising, but it's why I guess it's why we know so much about her. But for anyone, there's a really good little couple of essays about that online. So I just wanted to make that comment. But the thing that really also struck me is the Timothy, two aspects of the Timothy quote you used. And thank you so much for emphasizing that it was definitely not written by Paul. One is, it's almost humorous to think of how after World War II, at least in the United States, I don't know if it was in other countries, when they wanted the women to leave the factories so men could take the jobs and they needed to have new babies, they had all this advertising. Women, like, how wonderful it is to be in your kitchen with this new avocado green dish, I don't know if they had dishwashers, whatever, this new blender or whatever was the new toaster. And, it was like really a push back, which sounds very much what you were describing. So these are cycles, I guess, maybe, I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist. But I don't know if you would comment on that. But I don't know, it just really struck me. The other thing that's really ironic and painful and ridiculous is that, of course, that Timothy reading is read on a Sunday, and Jesus commissioning Mary Magdalene to speak is not read on a Sunday. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, like the sociological, like cycles maybe of the, if that's observed in other scripture texts.
I think that you're exactly right, that it's always cyclical, is that we have these periods where we open maybe a little bit and then the jaws snap shut again. I think that scripture is it's meant to be interpreted. It doesn't sit in a book and it doesn't have some static meaning in and of itself. At least I don't think so. I think that texts are meant to be read and thought about and reflected upon and discussed in community. And so here it is, this text of 1 Timothy, or a text that is much more empowering to women, like the Tabitha and Lydia text. And I think you're exactly right. Why don't we read those in the liturgical cycle? Why would we read 1 Timothy? I don't understand the value of reading that text. That doesn't make any sense to me. Who is, it's why are we reading this text over against many others that I think are much more liberating and uplifting texts? So liturgically, I think that there's been a huge conservative pushback, a lot with the language and many other things that have happened liturgically. I'm not an expert, but I've just experienced it as a churchgoer myself. And I see this in the liturgical cycle. I see it in interpretation of scripture. So yeah, it's exactly as you said, there is a push now among conservative Catholic women to say, isn't it great that we can have our husbands interpret this for us? I know it makes me want to cry. But this is like, oh, it's so wonderful to be in my kitchen. It's so wonderful to, be a woman, and I see these things happening all the time. And so I think it is cyclical. I hope that we're coming out of it. I think we need to keep pushing, can't let go, can't rest.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita.
Thanks, Rita. So it is 8:06 already.
Okay.
So there's 3 people here who have a question. I hate to let things slide by, but want to honor your time and everybody's time.
Thanks.
So
Yeah.
such a great conversation and
Such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, it is. It's
You're
just great.
welcome to share if you do have a question, if you want to send me an email, please feel free to. I didn't put that. I don't think I put it on my.
We can put it.
slides.
We can add it.
Great.
We'll send out everything tomorrow, and we can add that because I mean, these are the kind of conversations I want to never end, but we just need to have some time. And I love Rose's idea. I mean, I think the frustration for all of us is, I mean, the Bible is already, the scriptures are already very patriarchal. I mean, women have been written out, and then we get the lectionary, which, you know, doubles up or triples up in terms of, you know, writing women out. And so it's like people like you who are almost magical, pulling the rabbit out of the hat and going, look what we can find here. And it makes it so frustrating that it has to be like that. Why isn't the story told in the way it really was? And so that's, you know, we all feel that frustration, but which is why we're triply grateful for you and all the work you do, and so many feminists, biblical scholars and theologians who have really, you know, completely changed our worlds. I mean, all of us have had the experience of going, why didn't we know about this when we were, you know, you don't get it till at some later point, and it's so frustrating. But thank you for your work, and thank you all for your wonderful questions and for the wonderful work you do to keep bringing these things forward, because it will happen. So is there some,
I'm just reading the chat. Someone said that in the Ecumenical Catholic Church, they use a different lectionary.
Yeah. It's good. Yep.
Good stuff.
Okay, so thank you again. And so I'm going to turn this back over to Russ, who's going to pray us out of here. And thank you all.